So now as we move on to the next part of our program, which I think is just a stellar part of our program and will really prep us for tomorrow, we're going to hear from our different work group co-chairs. And perfect. I was hoping that there would be a slide here. I believe I'm going to run through I'm going to highlight our 4 working groups and the co-chairs for each, and then I think we'll go in sequence from group to group. So our first group is the Standards Work Group, and this is led by Bruce Bray from University of Utah and Bob Greenis from Arizona State University. Our next group that or do we have slide? Actually, I'll turn it over to them, and I guess I will moderate in between. So thanks, Bruce and Bob.
Hello, I'm Bruce Bray, a cardiologist and a clinical informaticist at the University of Utah. And along with Bob Greenis and Alan Flynn have been sort of co-chairing the Standards Work Group for MCBK. What we would like to do today is to just introduce kind of the direction we've been going in the Standards Group. Of course, you would think a Standards Group like this one is not about creating standards. The nice thing about standards is we already have so many of them to choose from. We're more about identifying relevant standards for knowledge mobilization, and then how to actually collaborate on implementing those models. Some reason not showing the right screen. So back to the second. I guess there's a delay. So the idea is that there's many standards from a standpoint of terminologies, information models, messaging standards, imaging, and so forth. As OMG BPM Health has come on the scene, there are evolving standards for workflow modeling that are relevant for care pathways and so forth, and so on. So as a number of these computable knowledge artifacts become available, it is increasingly more important to develop the standards or actually implement them in order to make things more scalable. And so in addition to the standards, what is emerging is a number of collaborative implementation groups, such as some of those are inside HL7 as accelerators. Some of them are in OMG, the BPM Health group, for instance. Some of those groups are inside places like ACTS, the AHRQ ACTS, and then various healthcare providers and various commercial entities are also starting to collaborate on how to scale these kind of things. And you've basically seen a number of those examples throughout the presentation so far today. I'll turn it over to Bob to then talk about the metadata modeling that we've been working on in our group for the last 3 months.
Good afternoon. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our focus in the standards work group on metadata. And we see metadata as a key means to make CBK artifacts findable, accessible, integratable, or interoperable and reusable. There really are metadata needs when you're creating knowledge to kind of think about what the purpose is that you're doing it for and how it's going to be integrated to a workflow process, whether it's research or clinical or other kinds of purposes, and make it able to be managed in a repository. We've heard about knowledge repositories, and a lot of the attributes of those that we've been discussing really relate to those aspects that allow it to be findable, accessible, and so on. And also the interoperable and reusable relate to the form and the standards used in creating it. So all of these need to be reflected in searchable criteria if you're going to curate and manage knowledge resources. And then when you, and Alan, I think I referred to this earlier, but when you are going to actually execute or integrate the knowledge artifact into a workflow process, you may need to, at point of need, invoke that. So again, the need for being able to find it and access it and know how you're doing it in terms of what standards or methodologies are used is very important. So metadata we view as the kind of glue that allows a lot of the different organizations and their work on creating artifacts and managing them to be able to speak the same language. And one other area, beside the different collaborations that Bruce mentioned, in fact, is the AHRQ ACTS stakeholder group, which is a collaborative project of a number of people that have volunteered over the years to kind of develop actually over about a year and a half, to develop a roadmap for how to get from our current state of disjointed knowledge to delivering it at point of care. And now it's that ACTS project is focused a lot on the COVID crisis. But as part of that activity, we've been working with the ACTS group to see how we might be able to provide the metadata standards for coordinating that activity. So, and Steve Bernstein, I think, is talking tomorrow morning, so he may be able to give us some perspective on where that project, the whole ACTS activity stands. But and Alan will talk more about how we've actually tried to move this forward. So I think at this point, I'll turn it over to Alan to continue.
Great, thanks, Bob, and Bruce, and everyone else here as well who's joined the meeting. So that, yeah, very excited about the work of the standards work group within the MCBK movement and community. What you're seeing on the screen now is a list of folks who have been meeting almost every week since January, working on a metadata profile. We call it a profile in development. So it's about 6 months of work, lots of folks involved who have volunteered their time, and we've developed a working paper for this meeting. Actually, we've developed a number of materials, and I look forward to having some of you join us tomorrow in the afternoon, Eastern time, that is, for the standards work group breakout session. So at the bottom of this slide at tinyurl.com SWG2020, you can find all of these materials, including this working paper for this meeting on CBK metadata that's been produced by this outstanding group of folks here on this, shown on this slide. So I just want to answer the question for everyone here, what we'll be doing tomorrow during our breakout time. So in that metadata profile in the working paper for this meeting, we've been really wrestling with some difficult questions of categorizing metadata, and we've come up with a draft, incomplete, not yet settled, set of ideas here that we've listed in 11 categories of elements of CBK that can be categorized in these various ways potentially. Still needs more work, and that's what we're going to focus on some tomorrow, but we've come a long way. And so this is the current snapshot, these 11 categories of different types of metadata for describing CBK artifacts will be part of our focus tomorrow. So we'll break into task teams during the work group meeting tomorrow. We actually have not 3, but 4 real CBK artifacts described in our open folder for everyone in this community and everyone coming to attend our meeting tomorrow. And we're going to look at 4 different categories of metadata: type metadata, purpose metadata, coverage metadata, and domain metadata. And we're going to think about and work on those categories across use cases from the clinical, research, education, and public health spaces. And we're also going to think about, as Bob was saying, the life cycle of CBK objects from the perspective of creation, management, implementation and deployment, and use and evaluation. So no small task, but one that I'm very excited about to work with folks tomorrow as we meet for the standards work group. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Bruce, Bob, and Alan for the standards working group. We're a little behind, but these things tend to work out. And so I'm hopeful that we will move quickly through these updates on the work groups and still have ample time for the poster session and the interaction there. So I mentioned we have 4 working groups. The next one I'd like to open your eyes to is the technical infrastructure for MCBK work group. And the co-chairs of this work group are Leslie McIntosh from the Research Data Alliance and Chris Schaefer from UC San Francisco. So I'll give you both a few minutes to share what your group is working on. And you're muted,
Chris, I think you're muted.
So this is Chris, who can't unmute himself anytime, any day. In the interest of time, I'll keep it short. If you're an infrastructure geek, you know who you are, come to our session. But in the interest of sharing a little bit more than that, we'll go ahead and move on to our next slide. These are the 3 of us who have been leading this effort, Leslie and myself, ably helped by Peter, as well as Helen and several others at the MCBK headquarters. Our charge is to identify the landscape of infrastructure stakeholders. I'm not going to read everything here. Describe framework components necessary for MCBK. Identify use cases that connect stakeholders to those framework components. And that's a really important part of what we're doing, is identifying the use cases and figuring out how to translate them to the other elements of technical infrastructure. And finally, acting as a clearinghouse for news and events of interest to infrastructure stakeholders, which we do through our listserv. Our next, we have a number of discussion points that we have been talking about over the past year. We want identifying the framework components necessary to move CPK from generation to practice. And then this whole list here took us quite a while to actually come up with, although it seems simple on the face of it, but thinking about each of these elements is complex within itself and fun to talk about. So come and chat with us tomorrow. Facilitating testing, versioning, use, evaluation, scalability, interoperability, and dissemination of MCBK. So that's a tall order. In addition to that, I accidentally clicked my thing. We are trying to build a conceptual infrastructure model to support MCBK, and this is really thinking about ways to describe technical infrastructure in a systematic way that gives us a mental model of how infrastructure interacts with and facilitates all of the activities that were described in the first bullet. And then finally, what can we as a small group, we have our monthly meetings, we're not meeting weekly, so but feel like maybe we should meet more. But at any rate, how do we in our monthly meetings with our small group actually support the infrastructure movement? What does the developer community need from us? And answering those questions has been a big topic for us. Our action item is a position paper, which has gone through a number of different titles, and this is one of the iterations of the titles here: interoperability, infrastructure requirements for CPK in a heterogeneous landscape. We are writing a position paper. We have a pretty good draft of it, and Leslie has been the lead on that, so I'm going to let her talk about it now. So I'll hand it over to Leslie.
Thank you, Chris. So actually with the white paper, we are talking about the 3 principles. And if we put it into the context of FAIR, we're really focused on interoperability first, and then how what we need to think about to have a CBK interoperable environment, and have moved and we end up having more questions than we do have answers at this point, but thinking about not just what CBK is, but what it does and what the infrastructure will do to facilitate CBK. So we've also asked some individuals who are presenting posters this afternoon to, there are going to be 5 of people presenting more in-depth about their posters and how it ties into these principles of both interoperability, but also trust, and how do we build in and think about trust in our infrastructure. So come tomorrow and you can learn more about the paper and also what we're doing.
And with that, I think we're done and ready to hand it over to the next group.
Great, great. I'll take it. So that's a perfect transition to our next group, which is the Policy and Coordination for Quality and Trust Work Group. That's led by Blackford Middleton from Apervita and Jody Platt from University of Michigan. Hoping their slides will come up and some video from one of them to give us an update.
Kick us off. Thank you, Rachel. We are known by the shorthand, the Trust and Policy Work Group. And over the past few years, we've been working hard on trying to define attributes of trustworthy computable biomedical knowledge artifacts. Go ahead to the next. We've been looking at trust because it's become such a hot topic today. I think it was Peter Emby who quoted the term algorithmovigilance that you see in the bottom, but many, many articles have been raising this issue of bias in algorithms as well as trustworthiness of the results and all the implications downstream that might arise from biased data and biased inference from biased data. Next. The charge we were given by the steering committee was to identify gaps in policy and issues that would impact the quality of these computable biomedical knowledge resources or the trustworthiness thereof. We've been looking at the ecosystem broadly of what constitutes the broad knowledge supply chain, if you will. We've done some stakeholder analyses. We've gotten a couple of papers out on trustworthy attributes, one in the Learning Health Systems Journal. And we're looking at issues now pertaining to knowledge governance, or the idea of a knowledge commons and what might be the constructs or methods and procedures, if you will, that would allow us to create knowledge commons or even interlocking knowledge commons, and what might be ethical, legal, and social implications of how that would be done. Next. The paper I mentioned already appeared in Learning Health Systems Journal. Josh Richardson, myself, Jody Platt, Barry Blumenfeld, and we did a deep analysis, if you will, of a collection of stakeholders, over a dozen stakeholders, and found what were the attributes that one needed to trust from another in a pairwise analysis, and came up with these various attributes. And here they are depicted here: 9 trust attributes and 33 recommendations for maintaining trust across issues of competency and compliance with best practices and the like. I encourage you to look at that paper or the white paper that came out before it as well, freely available. Thanks to Chuck. As I mentioned, we're looking at the ideas of a knowledge commons, what might be the main means by which we maintain trust, not only across the levels, progressive levels of abstraction, encoding, and specification, as you know from the L1, 2, 3, 4 paradigm, but also then how are data across tiers of expression, tier 1 being the data, tier 2 being a logic, and tier 3 being forms, what might be different attributes or characteristics of maintenance of trust across this, we like to call it the L by T grid. Next. And I'll turn over to Jody.
Okay. Thank you. And so we have a really great group of people, and we hope that you'll join us tomorrow. In the last year, we've been sort of grappling with all of these different trust frameworks, trust principles that make trustworthy knowledge commons and knowledge repositories, whether those are guided by the 9 attributes that Blackford just mentioned, whether we're talking about the findability, accessibility, interoperability, or reusability, or others that have emerged. So there's a new trust framework for digital repositories that we've also been examining to inform trustworthy repositories, and the creation for us as a working group as a research agenda that can guide our work. And so we're really right now focused on these first 2 items. I can't talk and click at the same time. But so we're focused on these first 2 items here, and developing a survey of knowledge repositories to really understand what they're doing, both to make themselves trustworthy entities in what is a very complex ecosystem based on, if you didn't know before, what we've heard all day today. And the purpose of this survey is to identify common principles and practice guiding the governance of knowledge repositories, and to identify some of the common metadata practices that ensure the trustworthiness of the things that are in those repositories. So our work synergizes very well, I think, with the other working groups focusing mostly again on the sort of policy aspects and the trust and trustworthiness components. This, I hope, will orient us towards future work in developing measures of trustworthiness so we can really calibrate trust and understand, sort of take the pulse of the CBK ecosystem, and to then use those findings to inform policy and policymakers. So what we're going to do tomorrow is look at the survey that we've developed and examine sort of what we've been doing to date. Blackford will do a little presentation on sort of how we think about knowledge commons and knowledge repositories. We have others talking about our current research agenda. We have multiple people sort of presenting tomorrow from our working group that will then guide sort of what the heart of what we're doing tomorrow is, focusing on this survey, trying to refine it, make it a quality product that will then get into the field next year. So we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thanks for that update. And now our final work group, and we are caught up on time. So we really do have plenty of time before our 5:15 poster session. The last work group is called Sustainability for Mobilization and Inclusion. And it is led by Chris Dimmick from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality and Jerry Perry from the University of Arizona. Perfect.
Here we are.
Welcome.
So I'm Jerry Perry, and I will be presenting for the first few slides that we're sharing with the group. And then my terrific colleague, Chris Dimmick, will step in and set us up for what's going to be a fabulous day tomorrow. Like the other groups, we have changed our name a little bit over time. We were the Sustainability for Mobilization and Inclusion, and now we just call ourselves the S&I group for brevity, as it were. So our session right now, what we're going to talk about for this briefing, just a quick scope of our work group, some of the short and long-term goals that we've been engaged in. We're going to talk about some of the deliverables, and we want to talk about also what will happen at the breakout session starting tomorrow. So that's our intention for the way that we're going to be spending our time. And by the way, I just want to say how terrific it's been listening to the other co-chairs present on their work groups. I'm always impressed, and I get a deeper understanding every time we spend time together to learn about all of the terrific work everyone is doing. So a little bit about what the purpose of the S&I, or Sustainability and Inclusion Group, is. We have as a charter goal the idea of mobilizing diverse stakeholders in what we consider an ongoing and active engagement around the value proposition of computational biomedical knowledge. And our focus has largely been, for the last, going on 2 years now, on advocacy via a variety of communications and engagement strategies with key stakeholders. Our focus largely, as I mentioned, is that value proposition. And so the work that we find ourselves doing is sometimes at a meta level, talking about really messaging, marketing, and communications. So we have, of course, goals, and our goals are short and long-term. Some of our long-term goals really speak to the slide could advance, I guess, identifying and engaging with stakeholders representing all aspects of the CBK community. And the intention there is to ensure that voices and perspectives are included, whether it's from the commercial side or clinical side, associations or whatnot. We're also interested in building momentum that drive to move forward around CBK and the communication strategy and outreach that we've targeted. And we also have as a long-term goal the ability to discern at some point where there are vulnerabilities or gaps in the knowledge and the communication that function largely as barriers to accelerating the work that we want to do, because we know that this work is critically important, as has been mentioned on numerous occasions during the course of this session. We also have some short-term goals. We're focusing our efforts largely through pilots and examples to advocate with key organizations and professional societies to see if we can get a sense of how effectively we can be in communicating the value proposition. And we also want to focus on advocating through scholarship. And I believe this is where Chris is going to pick up at this point. I know the slide will hopefully advance now.
Yep, thanks, Jerry. So what did we do last year? Well, we explored the ways in which MCBK could collaborate with other organizations that have parallel or overlapping interests to MCBK's. So we were privileged last year to have representatives from these organizations share their time with us. So folks from OSL, ACOG, AMIA, and HIMSS shared how we could work best with their organizations. Jerry, could you advance the slide, please? We really learned a lot from those sessions. And in particular, we learned that we need to align our efforts and ultimately our value proposition with what members of those organizations need to accomplish. And in doing so, we really need to distinguish what makes MCBK's focus unique. So in terms of what we're doing tomorrow, we'd like to build on that work. And we'll start our session by working on advocacy with large organizations at a more tactical level. We'd like to target key organizations or professional societies and work toward developing something like a memorandum of understanding and an ambassador role with such organizations in order to realize their purpose. We'd also like to determine the collateral that's needed to work with those organizations. During the second portion of our work group breakout session, we'll work on advocacy through scholarship by brainstorming scholarship topics and publishing venues and determining who wants to tackle which topics. So we hope to see you tomorrow if you're interested in playing a great role in advocating for MCBK. And we're just a really fun and friendly group. So come join us. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you all of our working group co-chairs for your dedication to MCBK and for taking the time today to share what you've been working on and what's going to happen tomorrow. We'll have a few hours to work on these topics tomorrow, and I really encourage people to join in on the working group sessions.